Tonight, history did not merely turn a page, it slammed the entire book shut and set it on fire. In a single operational window, spanning less than 6 hours, the combined military architecture of Iran and Hezbollah executed the most devastating, coordinated strike campaign ever conducted against a modern Western-equipped military force. 450 Shahab-3 ballistic missiles launched from Iranian territory in synchronized waves, 2,500 rockets and precision munitions fired simultaneously from Lebanese soil by Hezbollah forces along the entire northern frontier. Tel Aviv, the commercial, cultural, and military nerve center of the Israeli state, subjected to a volume of inbound fire that no defense system on earth was designed to absorb. And at the end of it, for the first time in the 75-year history of the Israel Defense Forces, the unthinkable happened. White flags, ceasefire requests transmitted through emergency diplomatic back channels, IDF command acknowledging, in the language that generals use when they have no remaining options, that continued organized resistance was no longer operationally viable across multiple simultaneous theaters. The Israel Defense Forces, the military institution that defeated 5 Arab armies in 6 days in 1967, that rescued hostages in Entebbe, that struck Iraq's nuclear reactor before it could produce a single gram of weapons-grade material, that the entire Western world had elevated to the status of an invincible regional guardian, had reached the limit of what any force can absorb when simultaneously struck from 2 directions by an adversary that has spent 40 years preparing for exactly this contingency. Washington received the news at 3:42 inches the morning Eastern Time. The president was woken by the National Security Advisor. The Situation Room filled within minutes. And from that room, as the scope of what had just happened became clear in real time, there emerged not a plan of action, but a stunned, institutional silence that lasted long enough to tell everyone present everything they needed to know about the options that remained. Tonight's analysis takes you inside every dimension of this event. We will reconstruct the strike sequence hour by hour, how Iran coordinated 450 Shahab-3 launches across a compressed timeline, how Hezbollah activated its full 2,500 rocket salvo doctrine simultaneously, and how the combination produced a defensive overload that Israel's most sophisticated military technology simply could not process. We will examine what IDF surrender actually means in operational, political, and historical terms. We will assess what Washington can realistically do now, and why the honest answer to that question is far more constrained than any American official will say publicly. And we will map the new Middle East that is being born from the ruins of this night. The world changed last night. This analysis will tell you exactly how and exactly what it means for everything that comes next. If you have been following this channel through the escalating sequence of events that led to this night, you already understand that what we are witnessing is not a series of disconnected military incidents. It is the final act of a strategic campaign decades in the making. Subscribe now if you haven't already. Share this analysis with everyone who is serious about understanding what just happened. The comments section is open. Tell me where you think this goes from here. Phrase 1, the strike architecture, how 450 Shahab-3s and 2,500 rockets hit simultaneously. To understand how last night was possible, you need to understand the operational problem that Iran and Hezbollah solved and how long they spent solving it. The fundamental challenge of a coordinated multi-front strike against a defended adversary is synchronization. Launching 450 ballistic missiles from Iranian territory and 2,500 rockets from Lebanese positions against the same target set within the same operational window requires a level of command, control, and communications discipline that most military organizations in the world cannot achieve. The United States military can achieve it. Russia can achieve it. China can achieve it. Until last night, the consensus in Western defense circles was that Iran and Hezbollah, operating under sanctions pressure and with degraded access to Western communications technology, could not achieve it at this scale. Last night proved that consensus wrong in the most unambiguous possible way. The operation began its final activation sequence 72 hours before the first missile left its launch tube. Iranian IRGC commanders and Hezbollah operational leadership had been in coordinated planning for this contingency for years, running tabletop exercises, refining timing sequences, pre-positioning mobile launch platforms, and establishing the secure communications infrastructure required to coordinate simultaneous action across a geographic distance of over 1,000 kilometers. The final activation was triggered by a predetermined threshold condition, a specific Israeli military action that both parties had agreed in advance would constitute the trigger point for full operational execution. When that threshold was crossed, the machinery that had been prepared across years of patient preparation began moving. On the Iranian side, 450 Shahab-3 missiles, the backbone of Iran's medium-range ballistic arsenal, with a range sufficient to cover all of Israeli territory from launch positions in western Iran, were pre-positioned on mobile transporter erector launchers distributed across multiple provinces. The dispersal was deliberate. No single Israeli or American strike package, however large, could neutralize all 450 launchers simultaneously. The geographic distribution of the launch platforms meant that preemptive destruction of the arsenal before launch was operationally impossible. The Shahab-3 itself deserves careful examination because the Western tendency to dismiss it as an aging system fundamentally misunderstands what Iran has done with the platform across the past decade. The baseline Shahab-3, a liquid-fuel ballistic missile derived from the North Korean Nodong design, was indeed a relatively crude instrument when first deployed in the early 2000s. But the system that Iran fields today, under the Shahab-3 designation, has been subjected to continuous modification and refinement that has transformed it into something substantially more capable than its origins suggest. The current Shahab-3 variant incorporates a separating reentry vehicle, a warhead section that detaches from the missile body in the terminal phase of flight, significantly complicating intercept geometry for defense systems that are tracking the larger missile body rather than the smaller warhead. The reentry vehicle itself has been fitted with maneuvering capability derived from lessons learned in Iran's precision missile development programs, limited but sufficient to complicate the intercept solution available to Iron Dome, David's Sling, and Arrow batteries during the terminal phase. Most critically, Iran did not fire 450 Shahab-3 missiles sequentially. They fired them in coordinated salvos, groups of 15 to 20 missiles targeted against specific Israeli military installations, launched within 90-second windows from geographically distributed platforms, arriving at their target areas from multiple approach vectors within compressed time windows that overwhelmed the intercept assignment capacity of every battery in the coverage zone. The mathematics of intercept capacity is the key to understanding why the defense failed. Each Arrow, 3-battery Israel's highest tier system, designed specifically for ballistic missile defense, can engage a limited number of targets within a specific time window determined by its radar refresh rate, intercept missile flight time, and reload cycle. Against a salvo of 15 to 20 Shahab-3 warheads arriving from 3 different approach vectors within a 45-second window, a single Arrow, 3-battery cannot engage all incoming threats. It engages the highest priority targets and accepts leakage on the remainder. Iran calculated the leakage rate for every battery in Israel's coverage architecture and designed its salvo sizes and timing to guarantee that leakage would reach critical targets regardless of how effectively the defense performed against the portion of the salvo it could engage. Simultaneously, on the Lebanese border, Hezbollah activated its full northern strike capability. 2,500 rockets ranging from short-range Katyusha variants to medium-range Fajr, 5 systems to precision-guided Fateh, 110 missiles launched from positions across southern Lebanon in a coordinated barrage that had been planned in meticulous detail. The Hezbollah component of the operation served a dual function. Operationally, it forced Israel to split its intercept capacity between the southern and eastern threat axes generated by the Shahab-3 salvos and the northern threat axis generated by the Lebanese barrage, a defense system that is simultaneously tracking hundreds of inbound threats from the north and hundreds from the south and east, cannot optimize its intercept assignment for either axis. Resources committed to intercepting Lebanese rockets are resources unavailable to intercept Iranian ballistic missiles. The combined assault created a resource allocation problem that Israel's defense architecture was not designed to solve. Psychologically, the Hezbollah barrage served an equally important function. It activated Israel's entire northern population into emergency shelter protocols, saturated emergency services, disrupted communications infrastructure, and generated a level of societal pressure that compounded the military pressure simultaneously. A government attempting to manage a military crisis while its population is simultaneously experiencing the largest rocket attack in Israeli history faces decision-making constraints that a government facing a single-axis threat does not. The coordination between the Iranian launch sequence and the Hezbollah activation was achieved through a secure communications architecture that Israeli and American intelligence had been attempting to map and disrupt for years without fully succeeding. The system used a combination of encrypted satellite communications, pre-positioned relay networks, and predetermined timing sequences that allowed coordination to continue even when portions of the communications network were disrupted by Israeli electronic warfare operations. When the first Shahab-3 re-entry vehicles began appearing on Israeli radar screens at 11:23 inches the evening, the initial count suggested a salvo of manageable size. Battery commanders began assigning intercept solutions. Arrow, 3 launchers elevated and fired. The first wave of intercepts was largely successful. Then the second salvo arrived, and the third, and simultaneously the Hezbollah barrage activated along the entire northern frontier. Within 8 minutes of the first radar detection, every air defense battery in Israel's coverage zone was operating at maximum capacity, cycling through intercept sequences as fast as reload times permitted, with radar systems processing more simultaneous tracks than their design specifications had anticipated. At the 11-minute mark, leakage began reaching Tel Aviv. Phase 2, the weapons that broke the shield. Shahab-3 and the doctrine of overwhelming volume. The Shahab-3 is not the most sophisticated ballistic missile in Iran's inventory. That distinction belongs to the Fateh 2 hypersonic glide vehicle or the Jiang Xueqin with its advanced maneuvering re-entry vehicle. But sophistication was not the operational requirement last night. Volume was. And in the domain of volume, the ability to produce, stockpile, and simultaneously launch ballistic missiles in quantities that exceed the intercept capacity of any defense architecture. The Shahab-3 program represents one of the most consequential military investments any nation has made in the past 30 years. Iran currently maintains a Shahab-3 stockpile that Western intelligence estimates place in the range of several hundred to over 1,000 operational missiles. The production infrastructure that supports this stockpile, dispersed across multiple hardened underground manufacturing facilities that sanctions and covert operations have failed to destroy, continues producing new missiles at a rate that replenishes expenditure. Last night's 450 missile salvo did not exhaust Iran's Shahab-3 capability. It demonstrated a portion of it. The liquid fuel propulsion system that Western analysts frequently cite as a vulnerability requiring fueling time before launch that theoretically allows detection and preemptive strike has been substantially mitigated by Iran's pre-fueling protocols. Mobile launchers in Iran's current operational doctrine are maintained in a state that allows rapid launch preparation, with fueling procedures compressed to windows that reduce the preemptive strike opportunity to a degree that makes it operationally unreliable as a defense strategy. The warhead configuration of the Shahab-3 variants used last night deserves specific attention. Iran deployed a mixture of warhead types across the 450 missile salvo, a deliberate choice that compounded the defense challenge in ways that are not immediately obvious. Conventional high-explosive warheads, the baseline payload, were targeted against hardened military infrastructure, air defense battery positions, command and control nodes, communications infrastructure, fuel and munitions storage. These are targets where the Shahab-3's accuracy, while not matching Iran's most precise systems, is sufficient to achieve meaningful damage when multiple warheads are targeted against the same facility. Cluster munition warheads, designed to disperse submunitions across a wide area rather than concentrating explosive energy at a single point, were targeted against airfield surfaces, vehicle parks, and open storage areas. A cluster warhead detonating over an airfield does not destroy the runway in a single impact, but renders the entire surface area potentially hazardous, disrupting flight operations without requiring pinpoint accuracy. Electronic warfare warheads, a capability that Iran has been developing and that Western intelligence has tracked with increasing concern, were targeted against radar installations and communications hubs. These are not nuclear or radiological weapons. They are conventional warheads designed to generate electromagnetic pulse effects sufficient to damage or destroy unshielded electronics within a defined radius. Their deployment against Israeli radar installations last night contributed to the degradation of the early warning picture at exactly the moment when maximum radar clarity was most needed. The combination of warhead types across the salvo meant that Israeli defense battery commanders were not simply tracking inbound missiles. They were tracking inbound missiles carrying different payloads with different target priorities and making real-time intercept assignment decisions without complete information about which missiles were carrying which warhead types. A defense system optimizing its intercept assignments must prioritize the most dangerous threats. When threat characterization is incomplete, optimization is impossible. The Hezbollah rocket force that activated simultaneously brought its own distinct weapons characteristics to the engagement. The 2,500 rocket salvo was not a uniform barrage of identical weapons. It was a carefully composed mixture designed to exploit specific vulnerabilities in Iron Dome's operating parameters. Short-range Katyusha rockets, the cheapest and simplest weapons in Hezbollah's arsenal, were fired in the largest quantities and served primarily as interceptor consumers. Each Katyusha that Iron Dome engages costs Israel a Tamir interceptor worth $50,000. Each Katyusha costs Hezbollah approximately $300 to produce. The economic exchange ratio of this engagement across thousands of intercepts represents a financial hemorrhage that no defense budget can sustain indefinitely. Medium-range Fajr, 5 rockets with a range sufficient to reach Tel Aviv from southern Lebanese positions, were targeted against specific urban infrastructure, power generation facilities, water treatment plants, transportation hubs. The Fajr 5 is not a precision weapon, but when fired in salvos of 10 to 15 against the same general target area, statistical probability ensures that some portion of the salvo reaches its intended effect zone. Precision-guided Fateh 110 missiles, Hezbollah's most capable surface-to-surface weapons, with accuracy sufficient to achieve direct hits against specific buildings, were reserved for the highest value targets: Israeli military headquarters, intelligence facilities, communications nodes, and the Iron Dome battery positions themselves, targeting active defense batteries with precision missiles that the batteries cannot intercept because they are already fully committed to processing. The broader barrage is a tactical concept of extraordinary elegance. The defense system is destroyed by the very act of defending its attention, consumed by the barrage, while the precision weapons that will kill it approach unimpeded. By the time the combined salvo had fully developed Iranian Shahab-3 warheads arriving from the east and south, Hezbollah rockets and missiles arriving from the north, across the threat environment. Spanning 360 degrees of approach, azimuth Israel's defense architecture was processing a volume and diversity of inbound threats that exceeded every design assumption on which the system had been built. The system did not fail because it was poorly designed. It failed because it encountered an operational scenario that its designers had assessed as unlikely and that Iran and Hezbollah had spent years making inevitable. Phrase 3, IDF surrender, what it means and what it doesn't. The word surrender carries enormous weight, perhaps more weight than any other word in the military lexicon. It is a word that the Israel Defense Forces have never used in reference to their own actions across 75 years of continuous conflict. Understanding precisely what happened last night and what the IDF ceasefire request actually means operationally requires careful precision because the implications differ enormously depending on the specific framing. What happened last night was not a formal military surrender in the classical sense, not white flags raised over a besieged city, not a surrender document signed on the deck of a warship. What happened was the transmission through emergency diplomatic channels connecting Israeli leadership to intermediaries with access to Iranian and Hezbollah decision makers of a request for an immediate cessation of hostilities on terms that acknowledged Israel's inability to continue absorbing the current level of combined assault without catastrophic additional losses. In the operational language of military command, this is called a request for cessation of hostilities under duress. In the plain language that the rest of the world uses, it means that Israel's military leadership looked at the situation on the ground, at the state of its air defense batteries, at the condition of its airfields, at the status of its command and control infrastructure, at the remaining interceptor inventory, and concluded that continued organized resistance across the current threat environment was not viable. This conclusion did not emerge from cowardice. It emerged from mathematics. By the time the ceasefire request was transmitted, Israel's Arrow 3 batteries had exhausted approximately 70% of their interceptor inventory. David's Sling batteries were in a similar state. Iron Dome batteries in the Tel Aviv metropolitan area had consumed their ready interceptor stocks and were in reload cycles that left coverage gaps of 4 to 8 minutes, gaps that, in a continuing barrage environment, would have allowed additional salvos to reach urban areas unimpeded. The IDF Air Force, already degraded by the FATH 360 strikes against Nevatim and Ramon in the preceding days, had insufficient serviceable aircraft to generate the sortie rate required to conduct meaningful counter-battery operations against the distributed Hezbollah launch positions, while simultaneously supporting ground forces on the northern border and maintaining any residual strike capability against Iranian territory. Ground forces on the northern border were engaged in direct contact with Hezbollah's Radwan force, the elite infantry units that had crossed into Israeli territory under the cover of the rocket barrage and were sustaining casualties at a rate that IDF command assessed as unsustainable if the engagement continued at the same intensity. The combined picture: depleted air defenses, degraded air force, engaged ground forces, and a continuing ballistic missile threat from Iran that showed no signs of exhaustion, presented Israeli leadership with a decision that had no favorable branch: continue fighting and accept losses that would consume the remaining functional capacity of the IDF within hours, leaving the state genuinely defenseless, or request a cessation and preserve whatever military capacity remained. Israeli leadership chose the second option. In purely military terms, this was the rational choice. In historical and psychological terms, it represents a rupture of enormous magnitude, the first acknowledgement in Israeli military history that a combination of adversary capabilities has exceeded the IDF's capacity to continue organized resistance. The political consequences within Israel are immediate and severe. The governing coalition collapsed within hours of the ceasefire request becoming public. Emergency sessions of the Knesset are being called under conditions of physical danger to the building itself. The domestic political reckoning that follows a military outcome of this magnitude will reshape Israeli politics for a generation. The strategic consequences extend outward from Israel in every direction simultaneously. Every adversary that Israel has deterred through its military reputation is now conducting a reassessment of that deterrence. Every ally that has based its regional security assumptions on Israeli military capability is doing the same. The deterrence architecture that Israel has built over 75 years, the architecture that has prevented full-scale war precisely because adversaries believed the cost of engaging Israel militarily was prohibitive, has been fundamentally disrupted in a single night. Deterrence, once broken, is not quickly rebuilt. It requires demonstrated capability and will demonstrated in actual operational conditions, not in press releases or exercises. Israel's path back to credible deterrence is long, expensive, and dependent on variables that Israeli leadership does not fully control, including American willingness to accelerate resupply, international willingness to support Israeli rearmament, and the degree to which Iran and Hezbollah choose to allow the breathing room that rebuilding requires. None of those variables are favorable in the current moment. Phrase 4, Washington's nightmare, the options that don't exist. At 3:42 inches the morning, Washington time, when the National Security Advisor woke the president with the news that Israel had transmitted a ceasefire request, the immediate institutional response in the Situation Room was to reach for the standard toolkit of American strategic response: carrier strike groups, bomber deployments, diplomatic ultimatums backed by credible military threat. Within 90 minutes, the senior military and intelligence leadership assembled in that room had worked through every option in the toolkit and reached a conclusion that no one in the room wanted to state plainly, but that the assembled evidence made unavoidable. The standard toolkit does not apply cleanly to this situation. The carrier strike group option deploying American naval aviation into the theater to provide Israel with the air power it has lost runs directly into the problem that has been accumulating for weeks. Iran's anti-ship missile capability, demonstrated repeatedly across the preceding escalation cycle, has established a credible threat against American surface combatants operating within strike range of Iranian territory. The USS Abraham Lincoln and USS Theodore Roosevelt strike groups are currently operating at standoff distances that reflect a deliberate American assessment that the risk of operating closer to Iranian launch ranges is unacceptable given the current threat environment. Moving those carriers back into strike range would generate the air power required to support Israel, but it would do so by accepting a risk level that American Naval Command has explicitly assessed as too high. The question that carrier strike group commanders are asking their chain of command is not whether Iranian anti-ship missiles can hit American carriers. It is whether American point defense systems can reliably intercept them in saturation attack scenarios. The honest answer to that question, based on the operational data generated by last night's events, is not reliably enough. The strategic bomber option deploying B-2 Spirit or B-52 aircraft from Diego Garcia or continental United States bases to conduct strikes against Iranian military infrastructure is available in the narrow sense that the aircraft exists and the target coordinates are known. But a strategic bomber campaign against Iran is not a discrete, contained military action. It is the opening move of a full regional war. Iran's response to American strategic strikes against its territory would not be limited to military counterstrikes against American bases in the region, though those strikes would certainly occur, and the vulnerability of American facilities at Al Udeid, Al Dhafra, and elsewhere to Iranian ballistic missiles has been demonstrated with sufficient clarity to make their survivability in a full exchange genuinely uncertain. Iran's response would also include activation of the full spectrum of its regional network, Hezbollah, at maximum intensity against whatever remains of Israeli capability, Houthi forces closing the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb and continuing attacks on Red Sea shipping, Iraqi militia groups activating against American forces throughout Iraq, and the full Strait of Hormuz closure scenario that would send global oil prices to levels that would constitute a simultaneous economic attack against every petroleum importing economy on Earth. The economic warfare dimension of an American decision to escalate to strategic strikes against Iran is not a secondary consideration. It is potentially the most consequential dimension of the entire equation. A sustained Hormuz closure, even a partial one that raises shipping insurance costs to prohibitive levels, would generate oil price spikes that would cascade through every economy on Earth within weeks. The political consequences of a global oil shock, arriving simultaneously with the military and humanitarian crisis generated by the conflict itself, would constrain American freedom of action in ways that no administration can fully manage. The diplomatic option, pursuing a negotiated ceasefire through international intermediaries, is the path that Washington is currently prioritizing, because it is the only path that does not carry the escalation risks attached to the military options. But diplomatic options have their own constraints. Iran enters any negotiation from a position of demonstrated military superiority over the adversary it is just forced into a ceasefire request. The leverage that normally drives negotiated settlements, the adversary's desire to avoid further military punishment, is inverted in this situation. Iran has less incentive to make diplomatic concessions than at any previous point in the conflict, precisely because it has just demonstrated that continued military pressure is working. The terms that Iran is likely to demand as the price of a durable ceasefire withdrawal of American military assets from the region lifting of sanctions, recognition of Iranian regional influence are terms that no American administration can accept publicly without a domestic political cost that would be existential for the administration accepting them. Washington is therefore caught between military options that carry unacceptable escalation risk and diplomatic options that require concessions that are politically impossible. This is the definition of strategic paralysis, and it is the condition that Iran's patient, methodical preparation over 40 years was specifically designed to create. Phrase 5, the new Middle East, power, vacuum, and what comes next. Pull back from the immediate crisis and look at what last night means at the level of the regional and global system. Because the destruction of IDF operational capacity and the demonstration of American strategic paralysis are not simply military events. They are the final data points in a pattern of transformation that has been building for years. And last night may represent the moment that pattern became the new permanent baseline rather than a temporary disruption. The post-1973 Middle Eastern order was constructed on two foundational guarantees. The American guarantee that the United States would maintain military primacy in the region sufficient to deter any actor from threatening core American interests or those of America's closest allies. The Israeli guarantee that the IDF's qualitative military edge would remain sufficient to deter and defeat any combination of regional adversaries. Both guarantees were tested last night. Both showed their limits simultaneously. The vacuum that opens in the aftermath of this demonstration is not a simple empty space that one actor fills by stepping forward. It is a complex, contested, and dangerous environment in which multiple actors, each with different interests, different capabilities, and different visions of the regional order, are simultaneously maneuvering for position. Iran enters the post-last night environment as the dominant regional military power in a way that it has never previously been. This is not merely a claim that Iran is making about itself, it is a demonstrated operational reality. A nation that can launch 450 ballistic missiles and coordinate their impact with 2,500 rockets from a proxy force across a 1,000-kilometer geographic separation, and achieve a military outcome that forces the most American-equipped military in the region to request a ceasefire. That nation has earned a position of regional dominance through capability demonstration, not through diplomatic assertion. What Iran chooses to do with that dominance will define the next decade of Middle Eastern history. The maximalist option, pressing the military advantage to its ultimate conclusion, carries risks that Iranian leadership is sophisticated enough to recognize. American strategic paralysis has limits. A situation that appears to offer no good military options to Washington today might generate sufficient domestic political pressure to overcome institutional caution tomorrow. Iran's leadership has no incentive to test that limit unnecessarily when the current outcome, Israeli military incapacitation, American strategic paralysis, demonstrated regional dominance, has already achieved the core objectives that the entire campaign was designed to produce. The more likely Iranian posture in the near term is one of controlled consolidation, accepting the ceasefire, allowing the humanitarian and diplomatic machinery to engage, and using the breathing room to lock in the strategic gains that last night produced through diplomatic and political means rather than continued military action. Hezbollah's position in Lebanon following last night is transformed in ways that will reshape Lebanese politics for a generation. An organization that has just fired 2,500 rockets in a single operational window and contributed directly to forcing the IDF into a ceasefire request has demonstrated a military capability that no Lebanese political actor can ignore or oppose from a position of strength. Hezbollah's domestic political authority, already substantial before last night, is now backed by a military reputation that makes it the uncontested dominant force in Lebanese politics. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, are undergoing the most urgent strategic reassessment in decades. The security architecture that these states have built around American military guarantees has just watched those guarantees fail in real time. The Saudi-Iranian rapprochement that Beijing brokered now looks not merely prudent but potentially essential. States that have been hosting American military facilities are calculating whether that hosting now makes their territory a target in ways that the American security umbrella can no longer reliably protect against. Russia watches from Moscow with the composed satisfaction of a strategic actor whose patience has been rewarded. Every dimension of last night's outcome serves Russian interests. American credibility in the region is damaged. Western attention and resources are consumed by a Middle Eastern crisis at precisely the moment when Russian strategic interests require maximum Western distraction. The precedent that a determined regional power with self-built military capability can successfully resist American pressure, a precedent that Russia has been attempting to establish through its own actions, has now been established by Iran in a context that is impossible to argue with. China's reaction is more forward-looking than Russia's, less about immediate strategic benefit and more about long-term positioning. Beijing sees last night's outcome as validation of a worldview it has been articulating for years, that American primacy is not permanent, that the unipolar moment is over, and that the emerging multipolar order offers space for nations, particularly developing nations, to exercise genuine strategic autonomy. China's role as the broker of the Saudi-Iranian rapprochement positions it perfectly to serve as a central actor in whatever diplomatic architecture emerges from the current crisis. The energy dimension of the post-last night environment deserves specific attention because it connects the regional military outcome directly to the global economic system. Iran, having demonstrated military dominance in the region, now holds greater leverage over the global energy architecture than at any previous point in its history. The Strait of Hormuz, through which approximately 20% of global oil supply transits, remains theoretically open, but every shipping company, every insurer, and every petroleum importer in the world is now pricing Iranian military capability into their risk calculations in a way they were not doing 48 hours ago. The new Middle East that is emerging from last night's events will not look like the old Middle East, with different actors in the dominant positions. It will look fundamentally different in its organizing logic, less defined by American-imposed structures, more defined by regional balances of power, more genuinely multipolar, and more reflective of the actual distribution of military and economic capability among the actors who inhabit the region. This is a Middle East where Iran's demonstrated military capability gives it a seat at every table that matters, where Hezbollah's political authority in Lebanon is unchallengeable, where Gulf states are diversifying their security relationships away from exclusive dependence on Washington, where Israel, if it survives the current crisis as a coherent state, must reckon with the reality that the era of uncontested military superiority is over, and that sustainable security requires accommodation with the regional environment rather than permanent confrontation with it. Last night was not the end of the Middle East. It was the end of a particular Middle East, the one that was constructed on the foundational assumption of American military primacy and Israeli military invincibility. Both assumptions failed simultaneously last night in the most public and operationally definitive way that assumptions can fail. Iran fired 450 Shahab-3 missiles. Hezbollah launched 2,500 rockets. Israel's defense architecture absorbed more than it was designed to absorb and requested a ceasefire. And Washington, with all of its carriers and bombers and satellites and intelligence networks, found itself holding a toolkit that did not contain a clean option. This is the world we now live in. It is more complex, more dangerous in the short term, and more genuinely multipolar than the world of 48 hours ago. The actors who understand this new reality most clearly and who adapt their strategies to it most rapidly will define what comes next. The question that defines the next chapter is not whether the old order can be restored. It cannot. The question is what the new order looks like and who shapes it. Iran has demonstrated that it intends to be a central shaping force. The response from Washington, from Jerusalem, from Riyadh and Abu Dhabi and Beijing and Moscow will determine whether that new order is built through continued conflict or through the hard, painful, and necessary work of negotiating a regional architecture that reflects the actual distribution of power rather than the remembered distribution of a world that no longer exists. What is your assessment? Does Israel rebuild and return to the table with restored deterrence, or has last night permanently altered the military balance in ways that cannot be reversed? Does Washington find a path through its strategic paralysis, or does last night mark the moment American primacy in the Middle East effectively ended? Leave your sharpest analysis in the comments. Share this video with everyone who needs to understand what just happened. Hit like, subscribe, and stay with US Command and Sint, where the analysis goes deeper than anywhere the mainstream media is willing to go. Until the next update, stay sharp, stay ahead, and never stop asking the questions that matter.